God doesn't exist. Well, at least that's what some claim. And that's the topic for today's Apologetics Monday on A Reason for Hope. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian Ben Vactor, and I'm happy to be here in studio with one of our pastors here at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona, Sean Richards.
And it is good to be here.
Hey, brother. How are you?
Having a good day.
You spoke at Salvarita yesterday, is that right?
Yeah, Calvary Salvarita, Junho Kim's church, and fantastic people over there. They are packing heat. They even got a gun holster in the pulpit. It's my kind of element.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for doing that. I'm glad it went well.
Yeah,
Well,
First
thanks.
Thessalonians.
Yeah, and thanks for what a wonderful series we've had here on Apologetics Monday that Sean's been teaching on through Islam. And if you want to go back and just go through that and just get a good handle from, can I trust the Quran? Did Muhammad exist? Comparative analysis of Paul's take on Jesus versus the Quran's take on Jesus.
Things
On and
you're going
on.
to hear from Muslims. We got exactly 19 hours of information for you.
Yeah, a lot of content, a lot of great content. But we're shifting focus now on the existence of God from different angles, different perspectives. And today's topic is no different. Or I should say, God doesn't exist. That is the statement. That is the claim. And so we're going to be tackling that today. If you're new and you're wondering, what are you guys doing? Well, this is just an off-the-cuff Bible answer program where we take questions from our live stream audience about the Christian faith. So it really is designed to be, it was originally a call-in show, but now it's a chat-in show. So you can catch us on our YouTube channel. We're live streaming there right now, and that channel is A Reason for Hope. So you just go to youtube.com/@A-Reason4Hope. You can also catch us on Facebook. Our Facebook is our church page, and that is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona. You can go to facebook.com/CCF Tucson. You can find us that way. And again, just use the comment section to ask your questions. We do this every Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Arizona time. And just use the chat. If it's a sincere Bible question, we'll take it. It's off the cuff, except for Mondays. You can also catch the stream on X by following our senior pastor, and his handle is Scott R4H. That's Pastor Scott Richards, and his handle is Scott R4H. You can also avoid social media altogether and go to our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com. Hit that Watch Live tab. You can not only watch this program every weekday, but also catch our services live. And there's a nice chat box, a prayer button that you can send prayer requests to our prayer team. And if you want to kind of maybe off the air ask a question, you can use our email address, and that is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. Before we dig deep into this question or this statement, God doesn't exist, we're going to take a moment to pray. Join us. And then if you have questions pertaining to today's topic, we'll obviously take those. But if you have another question relating to the Bible, comparative religions, Christian faith, whatnot, we'll save those for the rest of the week.
Whatnot.
Sean, would you do the honors?
Absolutely. Dad, thank you for the honor you've given Adrian and I to be able to not only engage with those who would speak contrary to your word, but to challenge those who are ultimately faced with these kind of objections and haven't taken the time to prepare. We ask that where you've ultimately led our hearts and minds in wanting to seek the answers for a reason for the hope that is within us, would also be encouraged and built up and excited to be able to equip your body with the same thing. We ask that we would not only take in this information, but be given opportunities to use it, and ultimately to do so in a way that reflects your heart. Whether it's with a firm hand or a soft touch, we ask that it would be with your voice, your truth, and your heart. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
That's true. All right, so yeah, we are moving from Islam into atheism categorically, and if you are watching this in post, you've probably noticed that a lot of our studies in this topic have a lot of overlap because it's going to essentially be revisiting the same information over and over again. And much like any other cult group, there is this mentality of brainwashing you have to break through, in that they would consider themselves beyond accountability or reproach to the sort of things they demand of you, while hoping you don't notice if I'm held to the standard, I end up in a lot of trouble. Because the foundational claim of atheism is understanding the three ways that that form of worldview is ultimately built on. A definition, which is again, what would atheism mean? A denial, what is it actually claiming in the negative about God? And of course, the claim that it's making in that denial. Most atheists would only claim one of these things, that they lack a belief in God. The problem is that that doesn't fit the term atheism. An agnostic would be an appropriate term for describing someone who is uncertain about the concept of anything. But when it comes to lacking simple knowledge, you'll find that most atheists, at least those who are proactive in their militancy and their evangelistic approach towards it, are more interested in talking about the abundance of knowledge they have rather than the lack of knowledge they have on a very specific topic. It's then that you need to hold them accountable for a very simple rule. He who makes the claim provides reason for it. Now, in conversations, you'll probably end up in a position where the moment you are put in a place where you have to ask or say that you are a Christian, the atheist takes that as if you've made a claim about the nature of God and then holds you accountable for it with the response, well, I'm an atheist. They'll treat that as an objection to the existence of God and then require you as a Christian to justify your belief in God. But that's not what has happened. They claim there is no God. And that is, again, the foundation of atheism. If they claim to lack a belief in God, then they are not atheist, they are agnostic, specifically about the concept of God. And of course, if they're in a position where they're totally neutral, well, they wouldn't be talking to you about it then, would they? The point being made, though, is this. When you're forced into a position to explain their beliefs to them, much like we've talked about with Islam before, and as we'll have to talk about with cult groups in the future as well, you almost have to convert them into a coherent version of their own belief system before you can properly criticize it, because most of them are in an environment where they are either told you can be as aggressive and troll-like as you want, and the Christian can't say anything because the moment they say they're a Christian, or they say that they are a Muslim, or they say they're a deist, they believe in the concept of God, that they are now the ones making the claim, and all you have to respond to own them is to say that you're an atheist. But once again, atheism is making a claim, and you need to be able to put them in a position where they claim they have the power to hold you accountable to something you haven't actually said. They want to avoid accountability because no actual definition of their beliefs is even understood, let alone given. And again, this kind of manipulation tactic, by avoiding accountability for what you say, by keeping it as ambiguous as possible, is what you need to avoid by knowing how conversations work. And when, again, you are going to make a clear statement, say, for example, if I claim to be a Christian, I need to provide a definition of what that means, an illustration of how that applies to real life, and of course, an application of how it impacts my life practically. Because note that if you have no definition, giving an illustration or an application is pointless because you don't know what you're talking about. No illustration makes the definition unclear, and no application shows that that definition, that term, makes no influence on real life. So in order to properly challenge atheism, we want to start with this first concept, that the claim of atheism is built on the claim there is no God. Now, the evidence for this is found in the word atheism itself, which is from the word theos, or theism, the study or understanding of God, with the A in front of it. And in, again, the language of atheism that it's based on, Greek, it is negating the concept of theos. And the opinions of atheists, which again are limited to the mind of the atheist, are where this is formed. The definition of God is, again, what they don't acknowledge the existence of. And this is, again, where we get into challenges, because human knowledge, which is where the understanding of the atheist is based on, is referring to not the totality of their knowledge, but the gap in their knowledge. They lack a belief in God, or they negate the concept of God. Whichever you want to hold them accountable to, pay attention to the flaw in that argument, because human knowledge, and they would be the first to acknowledge this, is limited by definition. Any gap in their knowledge wouldn't prove certainty, it would provide uncertainty. So if you're talking to a reasonable person who claims to be an atheist, it's essentially a 2-second conversion from being brought from an atheist to an agnostic. If they say, well, I lack a belief in God, they're not an atheist anymore. If they definitively say there is no God, they meet the definition of an atheist. And we should be consistent with this. When someone claims to be a Christian, they are making a claim about their understanding of who God is, how to have a relationship with Him, and where we find out about these things. A Christian that would deny the Trinity, the deity of Christ, salvation by grace through faith, or the authority of Scripture would, by definition, negate the fundamentals of what it means to be a Christian, because we use the Bible as our source and we are accountable to it. But if an atheist uses his own mind, his own perspective, his own knowledge and understanding of the universe, the first and most important challenge when they make the claim there is no God by associating themselves with atheism, you're turning the tables in the same position they want you to be in. You claim to be a Christian, so now you are totally accountable to have to explain everything regarding theism to my satisfaction, or you are worthy of mockery. Well, why doesn't that work both ways? Why can't they justify the very definition of what they mean, since, of course, atheism isn't centered around a definitive piece of literature, but the mind and perspective of an atheist, which is, again, limited. You want to put them in a place where they acknowledge uncertainty. And speaking of acknowledgement, acknowledging or dismissing certain types of gods or certain ideas about God wouldn't dismiss the category completely, since there are more ideas about God than what the atheist dismisses. If, say, for example, you ask them to explain a basic concept like omnipresence, omnipotence, the doctrine of the Trinity, any of those things, they'll either give you a bad answer or something that they copied and pasted off the internet they haven't actually understood for themselves. And in that position, again, the goal isn't to make them feel foolish, but it's for them to understand you're putting yourself in a lot bolder a position than you realize. And if you don't understand something about God, well, there's a lot of things that are true that I don't understand. I was blessed by the God of this universe by never having to actually take calculus and math. I managed to graduate before that was set as a requirement for my field. So the mind of Isaac Newton on a break went beyond me. But the idea of it being complicated to me and not being able to tell you what the derivative of something is not going to make it then false. It's going to mean that I have some homework to do if I want to re-pursue mathematics in my careers. But the issue is just that. They need to recognize what they actually believe in mean and be held accountable to it. Otherwise, their beliefs would never have come up in the first place. This is the first thing that you need to acknowledge when getting them to commit to an idea that atheism actually means something. And the second, and this is what you would find not in the more polite category of atheist, and they are out there, but more in the informed category of atheist, is that the concept of God conflicts with reality. That's not limited to their knowledge or perspective. It would be based on what we can observe in nature and saying that what we now understand about the universe has eliminated the possibility of God. And this is where we get into more of the philosophy of atheism, which is, again, to reject the concept rather than the specific person of Yahweh, Zeus, Thor, or Ra. And the opinions of the atheist, which, just like before, is limited to the mind of the atheist, is where this would form from. And the definition of God is, again, what they are criticizing. So you can narrow this down to two very specific areas, hopefully that you've taken the time yourself to understand, given your perspective. The evidence, again, for this is, again, within their minds, but the challenges to this need to start with the rejection of one God over others is, once again, just like before, based on their individual claims, not the category entirely. Since all of them are different kinds of things that claim to be God, the Greek and the Roman and the Persian and the Norse understanding of a deity is very different as far as its scope, what it's trying to explain, the evidence that it's based on, and the information around it, than the Jewish and Christian understanding of God. And you need to be able to point that out to them. If they reject a category, a concept of study because of emotional prejudice or failure to understand the concept, then it's not as rational a position as they've been told. And to categorically dismiss God from reality would require, just like before, a total understanding of reality, which is, again, where the lines are of what is and isn't possible. Only a certain type of atheist would claim a total understanding of all reality and that there is no room for God in it. And this can be quickly shown to be wrong in this assumption that has to be true if they are correct in affirming the claim there is no God. Now, before we get into effective counters to this, just understand what we've discussed so far. First and foremost, when someone uses the term atheist, ask what they mean by that. Hold them to a standard where they are either claiming there is no God or they are uncertain or neutral towards the concept of God, and approach it from there. But the more intellectually based atheist would disqualify God as a possible category or explanation of anything, since it conflicts with what we know about the known universe. So if we take a step back and challenge them on that and say, wait a minute, do you have a total understanding of all reality? Everything in the known universe, every scientific law, every single chemical reality and reaction that we know of, and that you find in that omniscience that you've achieved, there is no room for a power higher than you, a non-physical entity, anything that you want to express as far as your understanding of what a God is, since, of course, all of these different religions you're categorically dismissing discuss different things as far as what they mean by God. Hopefully, they'll be humble enough to say no, but again, there are even Christians who aren't that gracious in their willingness to acknowledge when they don't know something, and we want to be at least two fewer. But the point being made is this: when someone says something, that means something. Don't let them put you in a position where you have to defend yourself from their claim. When they've made the claim, they have to defend and justify and explain their position, just like you ought to, but that cuts both ways. So now let's get into how to counter this. When it comes to the most important counter to those who can commit to an actual definition of atheism, means that something is there to give them reasons to either believe their position or doubt their position. Once again, you think that this is only true for atheists, but we are also called to earnestly contend for the faith, to take every thought captive that raises itself against the knowledge of Christ. So when they have reasons to believe their position, that you look them up, you challenge them. When they have reasons to doubt their position, that you emphasize and drive those points home, they will have evidence for their position. But you need to reserve the right to express those reasons for yourself as well. And like we said at the start of the broadcast, you'll need to remind them over and over again that they actually have a belief in atheism. Contrary to yours, then that, again, needs to be supported just as much as they're demanding of you. And since, again, the most aggressive people aren't used to being on the defensive, this will, again, put the edge off you and give you the chance for at least a more neutral platform, or more likely to discern whether or not this person is sincere or just, as the modern term is, trolling you. Rage baiting, I think, is the modern term for kids, actually. Trolling was more my generation. Now, the warnings to be aware of as far as when those conversations start, explicitly in the concept and claim of God doesn't exist. I find no room for God in existence. The first thing to be aware of is that the most common assumption the atheist worldview is basing itself on is that of pure empiricism. Now, what does that mean? Well, empiricism or empirical things are that which are pertaining to your senses, that they are tangible, observable, and able to be interacted with sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing, of course. So when it comes to empiricism, or what could be called naturalism, it's the assumption, not the conclusion, but the assumption that nothing exists that can't be experienced with the five senses. Now, if you want to get around this issue, point out that that rule, that nothing exists apart from what can be experienced with the five senses, is in of itself a rule that can't be experienced with the five senses. The author and apologist Norman Geisler called this the Roadrunner tactic in his book, I Do Not Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, when the coyote runs over a cliff, and like in most cartoons, the laws of physics don't apply until they're acknowledged or pointed out. The point and emphasis in this is that to argue that there is nothing that can't be interacted with apart from your five senses is to claim a universal principle, not an actual tangible thing, a law that governs and is above all reality, that nothing exists apart from reality, except that rule. And suddenly, now you have something transcendent, something beyond nature that governs nature, and the God of naturalism is suddenly coming into the picture. The point being made is, again, to recognize a self-defeating position when they claim it. A transcendent law that impacts how you interpret reality is not reality. It's a governing principle. When we are talking about something transcendent and they categorically dismiss that, they have to both allow for and deny the rules that they are using to conclude that. Be aware of self-defeating claims like this. And obviously the most common ones, we'll bring this more up when we get to this in future weeks, but saying you can't know anything for certain. Well, do you know that for certain? Well, anything that you say about God is meaningless. Does that claim what you just said about God? On and on it goes. And another important thing to also note as well is that more often than not, the intellectual atheist is more using this as a mask for an emotional prejudice, whether it's a negative experience they've had with religious circles, or they're a part of a community that emphasizes and praises a bigoted approach, for all intents and purposes, towards anyone who holds a worldview different than their own, which is usually what they're trying to condemn, but we'll get to that too later. The reality is, to quote Ben Shapiro, feelings don't care about your facts. I know the original quote is in that reversed, but when you're talking to an atheist and you are seeming to be hitting a wall with them, you need to understand that just like facts don't care about your feelings, that reality is reality regardless of how you feel about it. If you're talking to someone who's basing their views of reality on how they feel, that applies too. Feelings don't care how many facts that you give. Feelings don't care how many arguments and pieces of evidence and responses, no matter how effective, that you give in response to their ideas, because they're not exchanging ideas. They're just spraying venom at the concept of anything called God, whether it's for social reasons, moral reasons, or personal reasons. That's another conversation to be had. But the point is just that. The emotional preferences of the atheist mean nothing, just like your emotional preferences about God would mean nothing to them. Don't buy the boast, again, and you'll hear this a lot, that they only follow the evidence, because our emotions do impact everything that we handle, and we need to point that out when you're asked to deal purely in facts. In exposing this, you may again show the real problem, and will spare you pointless conversations that they'll ultimately just ignore. Much like, again, identifying the insincere person, it's not to say that atheism has more of these types of people in its community. You'll find this in cult circles, you'll find this in those hostile to the Christian faith, but you'll also find people that can be reasoned with and think that they have a reasonable position. But because we live in a culture, again, that I should say, cultivates echo chambers. We need to be willing to break up some fallowed ground first before we get into softer issues. And if there is no ground to be gained there, then by all means, don't waste your time. Jesus had no problem walking away from people who called him out and demonized him. And there were also people he engaged with for the benefit of others that were gathered around and listening. But if you're in a one-on-one conversation and they are just there to waste your time and to spew information that they themselves don't understand and, again, are conflicting with their very arguments, don't waste your time. Don't think that you failed God or that you're the reason they're rejecting him. There needs to be some deeper heart work done before you can make progress with that type of personality.
If you're in a dialogue like that, just remember that when someone makes a truth claim, just take the logic of the truth claim and apply it to itself. That's all Sean is doing in dealing with like empiricism and so on. So just apply that and say, well, how do you know that? And some of them are self-defeating. Some of them require exhaustive knowledge of the universe. Like, for example, naturalism is the idea that all phenomena can be explained through natural causes and phenomena, natural laws. Materialism, the idea that everything that exists consists of matter. Even consciousness is the result of matter. Empiricism is a claim about knowledge, how we know things. I cannot know anything outside of the five senses. Take these things and just apply the logic to itself. Empiricism, well, that statement can't be known empirically. Naturalism, you'd have to have exhaustive knowledge of every phenomena in the universe to say that it's all natural law based. Materialism, you'd have to have exhaustive knowledge of the universe to suggest that nothing but matter exists. Well, just because you haven't seen something that does not consist of matter, which is another empirical fallacy, then you're presupposing. So it's all an assumption based on what you've experienced and saying, well, I've never seen it, so therefore it doesn't exist. Well, that would be like saying, what's the analogy that I've heard used before is if there's a special kind of rock with a certain kind of polka dots on it, to say that, well, nothing like that exists just because you haven't seen one. Maybe there's not one like that here on Earth. Maybe there's one like that somewhere else. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and we'll talk about inferences as well in the future, stuff that's concluded from the most likely scenario. Yeah. But even in that, too, when the atheist is making the effort to undermine your faith, whether it's for what they believe to be your benefit so that you aren't wasting your life or negatively impacting the lives of others, they would equivocate or miscategorize you as being just as much a threat to society as a nominal and a proactive Muslim, then of course you can hold them to their own standard and show that once again there is a difference between what you're claiming and what I actually believe, what you believe about me and what's actually true. But also even note as well that there's a lot of confusion about explanatory power, if you want to put it as fancy as possible, because in the atheist community, they will dovetail and jump back and forth between the definition of atheism as the claim that there is no God and simply lacking a belief in God.
Yeah.
If you go to the Atheist Association of North America, their website contradicts itself, and the actual definition of that word, by the way, in their About Us section by saying that atheism isn't a belief, it's a lack of belief in God. 3 paragraphs down, it starts with, so remember, atheism is about what you believe, and our belief is, and then it goes on from there.
Yeah.
But the point and emphasis is they are from a position of uncertainty, which means uncertainty, not certainty. Sowing doubt, or, and this is even more important, not having all the answers to their questions doesn't make a position false, because just like the Christian, the atheist doesn't have a total knowledge of everything about their belief as well. To demand a 100% immediate and satisfactory answer to every challenge or idea is unreasonable, since, of course, it wouldn't apply to the atheist either. Making or mistaking the category of my perception with the concept is the same mistake the worldview of atheism will make over and over again. Just because, say, for example, I can't get into all the nuances of church history does not mean that there aren't legitimate answers to that, and I don't speak for all of Christianity. Yet, the atheist holds me to that standard. And at the same time, if I challenge him about his understanding of the chemical structure and physics of how quarks work as opposed to just the atom itself, they may have to default to someone more knowledgeable than them. They may have an answer because of a very impressive and coincidental background, or they won't have an answer, but it won't matter because, again, it doesn't speak for all of atheism. Make sure that they're consistent about these issues because, once again, if you learn to spot it, a lot of these issues will resolve itself. Now, with the last half of the broadcast, we want to, of course, make a proactive effort to communicate our position and equip you all to be able to engage intellectually with an atheist who will either commit to or be forced into the claim that God doesn't exist. And what better response to that than providing evidence that God does exist? We'll have evidence, of course, for more specifics in terms of religion, but remember that in this conversation, when the topic has been brought up, God doesn't exist. You get them to commit to that statement or that concept that they are categorically denying, rejecting, or deem irrelevant the concept of God. You ought to then give them reasons to believe in a transcendent power. You don't have to prove Christianity's true in order to demonstrate that atheism is false and or incoherent. All that you are doing is answering the question, does the concept of God fit into what we can examine, test, and reasonably conclude from what we know about reality? If they demand more, they are being unreasonable. If they insist on a standard they themselves can't be held to, then they aren't sincere. But what's most important in these conversations, and I'm repeating myself because you will have to as well, is that if these issues come up and they change the topic and say, but what about the Salem witch trials and the Crusades? What about this terrorist act and you religious people are all the same? Well, bigotry aside, recognize that the conversation needs to stay on its intended topic. And if they don't care about the topic, then there's no need to continue talking about it. They should have never brought it up in the first place when they affirmed atheism. But if we instead commit to the topic, you can say, I'd love to talk about that at another time, but you're asking about history and the behavior of people. I'm talking to you about the philosophy and the concept of God. Can we stick to the topic, or are you just here to waste our time? So obviously, in the most neutral examination of evidence possible, and since atheists tend to have a regard and respect for scientific observation and data, we'll try to stick to that. The first and most important thing to bring up with atheists and to know by heart, at least to be able to properly understand and maybe to articulate upon later study, is what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam is the Arabic term for eternal. It was espoused and coined not originally by a Muslim, but nevertheless popularized by a Muslim scholar who, coming from a theistic worldview, argued from the origin of the universe as evidence for God. And this is how he did it. First premise is anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. The cause of the universe wouldn't be the universe itself or made of the kind of things that were introduced. This cause would be beyond space, time, and matter, as well as conscious enough to choose to make a universe, intelligent enough to make a universe that didn't collapse in on itself, and powerful enough to cause something like a universe to exist. The scientific principles that would determine this are, again, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. You don't cause something greater than yourself to occur, and something needs to be there to cause an effect. There aren't spontaneous nothings that cause everythings. We also note the Newtonian laws of physics that, again, an object will not move unless acted upon by an equal and opposite reaction. The action and reaction principle builds the same point. We have scientific conclusions from astronomers in the redshift expansion that was discovered actually here in Tucson in the Hubble Space Telescope Observatory. Albert Einstein confirmed the conclusions when he himself believed in an infinite and an always existing universe, he recognized that the expansion of light was going outward in its shift. And that meant, again, that the universe can observably and scientifically, to a chemical level, be recognized as expanding from a defined point. The fine-tuning of the laws of chemistry and physics are also important in this, and noting that, again, when this cause of the universe had to do so in just precise enough a way that it didn't collapse in on itself. We'll talk more about this in a second. But it's all noting around these kinds of conclusions. It's not requiring any religious book to exist. It's not requiring you to then come to the altar and give your life to Jesus. But if this conclusion is valid, atheism in of itself is a moot point, because we would then acknowledge a conscious, intelligent, eternal, omnipresent, well, all-knowing, but also all-powerful, or at least as powerful as the universe itself, entity that introduced the known universe, and his handiwork would, of course, reflect that. Now, the misunderstanding that you're going to have with atheists, and they continue to make the insistent on it today, is that the term, the first premise, anything that begins to exist, they instead hear everything begins to exist. We'll have another whole session discussing Richard Dawkins and those around him's fundamental misunderstanding of this, and again, well, who created God? But recognize that's where the error oftentimes occurs in this, and what you ought to be prepared for in follow-up conversations. But this evidence, the cause of the universe, whether they want to call it the Big Bang or Genesis 1:1, is irrelevant. What we're talking about is, because of things like thermodynamics, like Newtonian physics, like cause and effect, the universe didn't just show up from nothing. There had to be a cause comparable to it. It had to want to do it, be smart enough to do it in a way that works, and not be made of the things that were in of itself invented. So when we're talking about this, recognize first and foremost that that is where you ought to start. The second, and Adrian, you have probably done more research on this than I am able to do in the moment. My studies, again, in recent months have been mainly centered around Islam and cult groups, but secular groups, again, have very high respect for this argument in regards to the existence of God, and that's the fine-tuning of the universe. The simple way to put it is that design has a designer. If the nature of the universe as we observe it is so finely tuned for life that any form of adjustment in any of the laws of chemistry, physics, and our body's interaction with them would result in life being impossible, as well as the universe itself to have never successfully formed. We can talk about the code in our DNA, the specific arrangement of things supposedly formed for no purpose and were arranged in a perfectly functional pattern that produced the kind of life ideally and uniquely suited for this world, and the universe governed by the same laws that cause us to thrive, would be too precise to claim happened for no purpose. How this is illustrated is through two common slogans, that explosions in printing shops don't produce encyclopedias, and tornadoes in junkyards don't produce 747 jets. This is oftentimes how that's portrayed. They would emphasize that point, just like saying that chance, or assuming it happened the way atheist says it did, works both ways. If a Christian said, well, God did it, well, that was just as meaningless as if they say chance did it. If you say, well, creation, instead of, oh, well, atheists said so, so I believe them. Well, Christians say that creation happened, so I believe them. It would sound ridiculous if coming from either end. And we also need to note as well, this is what's called the Borel's law of probability. When it comes to calculating things by chance, they think, well, if it can be calculated, that means it's possible. No, according to, again, the laws of probability itself, the reality is any probability higher than 1 in 10 to the 50th power is entirely theoretical. It's fantasy. It can't actually occur in real life. The odds of, and this is just for perspective regarding the numbers are concerned, 1 in 10 to the 50 is impossibility mathematically. So if we're going to say, for example, by comparison, life came to existence by chance, well, the probability of even one of the 250 proteins that we would need to form a life so simple that it doesn't actually exist, it's just presented in order to satisfy atheist models, is 1 in 10 to the 41,000th power. Again, mathematical impossibility. 1 in 10 to the 50th. Any higher than that, 1 with 50 zeros after it, that's just theory. That's not going to take place in real life. We have 1 in 10 to the 41,000th power. 41,000 zeros after it. Now, let's compare that to, say, other big numbers we're familiar with. The number of grains of sand on the planet have been estimated at 7.5 with 21 zeros after it. That's a very large number. David Wood made this observation in a presentation he did on atheism. He said, if we're going to grant atheist dates of the universe and the trillions of years and so forth, the number of possible particle interactions, assuming that particles only can interact with each other at max at the speed of light, was calculated as 1 in 10 to the 149th power. So recognize this. Mathematical impossibility, 1 in 10 to the 50th power. Comparable to numbers, the number of particle interactions since the beginning of the known universe is calculated as almost 150 zeros after it. In order to get a life so simple, we need to step into the realm of 41,000 zeros after it. We're not talking about, well, weird stuff happens. You know, we're here, so we may as well just conclude that and just leave it at that, Mr. Scientific. We'll talk about this more when addressing books criticizing intelligent design, like the Blind Watchmaker and the puddle theory, that, of course, they would look around and say, well, this water is perfectly encapsulated in, of course, the puddle that we see today, that if it was any more, then we would, of course, break through this perfectly formed puddle. The puddle must have been designed. And again, they would criticize that and say, you fail to understand the nature of water, how it fills the volume of anything it comes into. The puddle could have been formed by chance. It could have been formed through intelligence. It doesn't prove anything. We will be happy to address that in detail, but just for brief and clarity's sake, recognize that that's making an assumption not just about the nature and functionality of water, but that it's missing the actual point that fine-tuning is arguing. You're criticizing the illustration, not the application and definition of what's actually at place here, because the alternatives mathematically go not just into the realm of impossibility, but blow it out of the water by thousands of degrees. So when we're talking about the actual issues at stand here, fine-tuning the laws of physics and chemistry, that shows again that there was an intention here, not an accident, and we can infer that from things that we again observe today. The issue that atheists will take with this, along with the books that we'll then be responding to, is that when an atheist hears a logical inference, they treat that as a logical assumption. That I'm not concluding this based off of actual data. They think that if you assume anything I don't like, that means that you are putting that into the conversation by blind faith without any reason. You need to be able to point out that, again, it's not because of their anti-supernatural bias that we suddenly are just as irrational. Just like the average uneducated Bible Belt Christian is going to just say, well, I have faith and, my pastor can answer this for me. They don't speak for all of Christianity. Likewise, the Reddit atheist troll shouldn't be the basis by which we start and interact with all atheists, but yet we're treated as if that's the case in these conversations. Make sure that we understand everything that's happening here. An inference is based off of data they don't like because of what it would conclude. But if we were to apply that to the other way and say, once again, just like we did before, well, if you show me evidence for common descent and show that evolution can be demonstrated down these developmental lines, I'm going to reject evidence for that because I don't like what that would mean. Then they would respond by saying, well, you're biased, you're bigoted, you're irrational, you're anti-evidence, and every other thing you can think of. That's not rational, yet it's exactly what atheists would do if you show them this evidence, and they would have to miscategorize the possibility of evidence contrary to their worldview. We don't want to do that. They shouldn't be allowed to either.
Yeah, because you're pointing these out as positive evidences for for drawing a reasonable conclusion that God exists. And if they're saying, well, that's not evidence, or they're not willing to look at those, or they have to really work hard to come with other explanations, then that becomes problematic.
Yeah, and obviously, just like anyone else in their position, we understand that it is difficult coming from a worldview and perspective, a community, a family, and even troublesome and weighty emotional background that would make you have to acknowledge things that you don't want to. They or may need to be time to work through that. But for the benefit of Christians listening, you need to be able to recognize when emotions are playing a role in blocking evidence, as opposed to misunderstanding and thinking that you've failed to adequately explain the evidence. There is a difference.
I usually just propose a real simple question. If someone, if you ask a question and they provide a truth claim answer, I will sometimes ask, do you believe that, or do you base that on emotional reasons, prejudicial reasons, or intellectual reasons? And that really causes a person, based on their answer, to open up and examine their assumptions. And if the person's honest, they'll tell you, well, I believe that for intellectual reasons. Because if they give you any other answer, like, oh, well, I believe it because of all of them, and then you just simply respond by saying, well, then do we arrive at truth, at knowledge, based on emotionalism or a prejudicial bias, or based on an intellectual pursuit of truth? Do we approach it epistemologically? How do we know things? And so that's what that word means. And so, but depending on how they answer, that kind of guides and directs, because you want to dialogue with the person. You don't want to talk at people. You want to talk with people.
You don't want to
And
be
that can
talked
really,
at either.
yeah, exactly. And that will also help you determine whether the person's being sincere or whether they're really just trying to, have gotcha moments with a Christian, because that's, someone's motive is difficult to determine. So sometimes you have to ask questions to God. And you see Jesus does this all the time. 9 out of 10 times when he's asked a question, he responds with another question. The reason for doing that is it causes the questioner to open up in their assumptions. And so that's why he responded that way. What's that book where how to debate, how to argue? It's
Tactics.
Yeah, Tactics by
Greg Koukl.
Koukl, yeah, that's a
Don't
really
ask me
good
to spell
research.
it. He's Dutch.
And just for clarity on the fine tuning, there's a lot of different lines of evidence in that arena.
Yeah, that's
So-
more than I got up here.
Yeah. So like fine tuning is the idea that the universe is finely tuned for observers to exist, for people to exist, from every cosmological constant, parameters, gravity, nuclear forces, every aspect is finely tuned, that if you were to change any, like imagine a board with tons of dials, about 100 or so dials, and each one has to be exactly set just right, all of them together, so that life is possible. And if you take just one dial and you change it by 1 degree, for example, how much matter is in the universe, what we're taught from physics is that life could not exist. If gravity was stronger or weaker, life could not exist. If the sun was larger or smaller, Earth could not have life. And there are so many of these parameters. And that's what it really means to have that finely tuned universe. The fine tuning argument is that some refer to it as. And it's really kind of a powerful, because the more we learn about how the universe works, the more we start to realize how impossible it is to have life, how difficult it is to have life, and how unique, how astronomically impossibly unique Earth is, and that it's teeming with life. So that's, some would refer to this as the anthropic principle, meaning that the universe was made for observers like us, for humans to exist, and so that its purpose is that. It's not that humans happen to exist. It's not that the universe just happens to have the conditions appropriate for humans to exist. No, the more we learn about the universe, it's beginning to reveal that no, the universe's purpose is for humans to exist, for life to exist. Second to that would be considered the intelligent design argument, the idea that things seem to be intelligently designed, and this is actually a measurable. This isn't a subjective inference. There is an actual scale. They've created a mathematical scale for judging whether something has the qualities of being intelligently designed or not. And they call this irreducible complexity. You see complexity in the earth, and you see specificity. So, for example, if I take a whole handful of alphabet, soup or alphabet cereal, and I dump it on the table, and all of a sudden it says Sean is smart and Adrian is dumb. Now, if I just took those exact letters and just mixed them up, you would say there's complexity. There are tons of letters in it. It's complex. It's not just a bunch of A's, a bunch of B's, or just a bunch of powdered cereal. There are tons of letters sitting here, so it's complex. But as soon as I specify it, Sean is smart, Adrian is dumb, now it's specified complexity. This level you don't see as natural phenomena. You don't see specified complexity in any area of life except in nature, but any other area we always conclude that a human intelligence created it. So what I'll do is I'll show students something like the backside of Mount Rushmore. I'll show it to them. I go, and I've explained these terms, and I'll say, do you see that this was designed? Do you see intelligence? And they go, no, it just looks like a regular mountain. And I go, let's go to the other side. And then I'll show the face of it, and they say, now, does this look like a rain erosion could have caused this? And so obviously the answer is, well, no. Nobody would ever look at that and infer that rain and wind and time created the faces on Mount Rushmore. I do the same thing with the Egyptian pyramids. I've been there several times, which is funny because I've never actually been to Mount Rushmore, but I've been to the pyramids. And I tell the joke about how when I first took my wife there, our first time to Egypt, I said, can you imagine that dust storms over thousands of years created these things, these structures? And she said, nuh-uh. And I go, no, that's how they were made. And I was just kidding, but because I sold it so well, she, for about a half a second, went, what? Like, she was like, you're serious? I'd never heard that. And believe me, for like a half a second. And I go, no, of course not. We would never look at a structure like that and say that it happened by chance. So intelligent design is the idea that we observe the results of intelligence. And when you look at what humans do, you look at a car, you look at a watch, you look at a building, you dig up structures. I can go, right in the desert here in Arizona. I can pick up a rock and pick up another rock, and an anthropologist can say that's a rock and that's an arrowhead. Now, I'll look at him and go, they both look like rocks to me. He goes, no, you can actually tell the difference once you know what you're looking for. That is an arrowhead. A human being actually chipped away. Nature can't make this. What? It looks just like a rock. That's how they can detect human intelligence. And that's why the SETI program exists, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They have money being spent to point radio, I forget what they're called, but the dishes into space to listen for frequencies and signals in the background and say, well, how would you know what you're listening to is just white noise versus like intelligent? They say, well, because we would find mathematical language in it. And there was a movie made that sort of illustrated this called Contact with Jodie Foster. And what was the other guy's name, the other actor? But anyhow, they are listening to white noise in space. There's always, space makes noise. And they finally started detecting math in the noise and discovered that it was a message from an intelligent source, a very, very superiorly intelligent source. But how would you know the difference? Well, when you look at human DNA, when you look at creatures, when you look at animals, you see things in nature that cannot be explained by random chance processes. It's impossible to explain these things, which is what drew me to become a Christian. The cosmological argument and the intelligent design reasoning just led me to believe that God must exist. There's no other explanation. that there has to be a timeless, eternal, uncaused cause for not just the universe, but life itself. And with that having been concluded, well, then what evidences are there for which religious expression best represents that God? And of course, that leads Sean to the next argument, which is God ceased from being invisible, as the poster child for atheism used to say, that God is invisible, intangible, eternally elusive. How does that make him any different from an imaginary God? Well, he ceased being intangible. He ceased being elusive, and he walked and talked with us for 33 years.
Yeah, the historical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth would blow the whole concept of God doesn't exist out of the water, because we as Christians believe that we have a documented and verifiable miracle recorded and verified in a moment of history. Now, if the atheist wants to, just like the issues with the, again, willingness they are to look at a shadow on Mars and say that's proof that there's an alien civilization here, yet they look at all the life here and just say, coincidence, nothing happens, would make gullibility in the Bible Belt seem like an informed scholarly perspective. But the issue is whether or not they're willing to take at face value the degree of detail that we are given, not just from the accounts of the eyewitnesses, but everything that they had to lose and everything they had to admit, and noting from the primary sources the sort of things that we have unheard of detail and verifiability in ancient history. Noting first and foremost that the biographies of early Christians, known as the Gospels, and the writings of early Christians are all irrelevant compared to the early church creeds that, according to even atheists, predate any of the Gospels and detail that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, and rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. Now, in a naturalistic worldview, the dead stay dead, but in this account, Jesus not only claims to be God, but in order to verify it observably, scientifically, and in a way that we could conclude rationally from the evidence, he showed not just to friends, not just people who, of course, believed in him, not individuals who could be explained as hallucinations, but groups as often as individuals. 500 documented eyewitnesses within months of the original Easter at one time. And we'll talk about this more as we get closer to the Easter. We're actually going to dedicate a whole Apologetics Monday to repeat this data in detail. But the most significant are regarding the testimonies of James, the son of Joseph, and Saul of Tarsus, both hostile to the claims of Jesus until they saw him alive again after his public death and burial. So the accounts of embarrassment, noting, say, for example, women being the primary eyewitnesses of the resurrection in a first-century Jewish culture, the disciples all abandoning Jesus in fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, not the sort of thing you admit. You have to form more assumptions, more biases, more conclusions, even according to, and we can note the perspective of former atheist Lee Strobel in his investigation said, there's just too much to deny here that I don't have enough faith to support. And even noting this, we don't have to just stop at the claim of Jesus of Nazareth. Name any religion you want. If even one miracle claim among the hundreds of millions, from hearsay to actual documentation, if one is accurate, then naturalism, atheism, the rejection of a transcendent power is false. You may come up with alternate explanations. We may lose our stand as Christianity, but that's not what we're here to criticize. Atheism stands on very shaky ground.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.